High among the jagged peaks, beyond a winding path of crushed bone-white stones, stood a library that few dared to visit. For centuries, rumors circulated around nearby villages of a place enshrouded in a perpetual hush, as if every living thing that approached it forgot how to speak. The building was old, older than anyone could precisely determine, constructed from dark slate and blackened oak, that appeared to resist the passage of time. Its tall windows, all smoked with filth and dust, guarded secrets better left uncovered. Many had ventured there for a prize rumored to lie within, an ancient folio of knowledge that promised to answer any question posed to it. But as the stories went, fewer returned. Those who did stumbled back to civilization maddened, their eyes wide and haunted, able to speak only of aisles of dusty tomes and of a presence that lurked behind them, scraping the floors like a beast imprisoned by its own hunger. Eventually, the library was all but abandoned, left to rot in the freezing wind and swirling mists of the mountaintop. No matter how dire the thirst for knowledge, people began to believe that the price to enter was far too high. On a winter's morning, a scholar named Rowena arrived at the village below the library, determined to break the silence that guarded its knowledge. She was slender, with quick eyes that held the spark of dedication. She had studied every rumor about the library's forbidden texts, every fragment of local lore that hinted at the wealth of information hidden in those endless shelves. And although hesitant, even a little frightened by the tales of monstrous guardians, she was convinced that the promise of knowledge would outweigh the danger. Rowena had read of a tome that could guide mortals to harness the wisdom of old, enabling them to influence fates as if they were pages in a book. Though many believed it to be myth, she clutched onto the possibility. Her research had led her to the conclusion that such a manuscript rested in the depths of the mountain repository. If she could just glimpse its pages, confirm its existence, then perhaps her sleepless nights and years of meticulous study would pay off. She set out determined, using directions gleaned from cryptic footnotes and half-lost maps. Her journey began in the village, where the cottages looked tired under a leaden sky. The locals offered uncertain, pitiful gazes. An old woman, clad in a tattered gray shawl, finally warned Rowena, "Beware the hush in that cursed place. If you value your soul, never speak above a whisper." Yet the old woman refused to say more. A hush fell over her, as though the memory bound her tongue. Rowena tried to glean more details from others, but the villagers turned away, refusing even to speak of the building on the mountain. Undeterred, Rowena secured provisions, some bread wrapped in cloth and a flask of warm tea. She had no illusions about the dangers. She had read about odd shapes carved into the library's walls, about the caretaker who was supposedly a woman once, yet now something far less than human. Rowena had learned of how some visitors had felt watched the moment they crossed the threshold, as if multiple invisible eyes lingered on every breath, waiting for the slightest slip in the library's sacred silence. Daylight was already weakening when Rowena began her ascent. Clouds clung to the rocky path, swirling pale and restless around her ankles. With each aching step, the temperature dropped, and her breath stiffened in the air. She felt the sensation of being followed. Every so often she turned, her heart tight with worry, but she was met only with an awful stillness. She swore she heard the hush pressing against her ears, like a living thing that wanted to snuff out the smallest sound. Finally, near dusk, she arrived at a courtyard fenced by towering pines. The library rose at the far edge, its peaked roof emerging from a bank of roiling fog. The ancient oak doors, tall and crosshatched, seemed to beckon in silent expectancy. No wind stirred, no bird called out. Even the crunch of gravel under Rowena's boots felt muted, as though her footsteps were swallowed by the strange quiet. She gingerly placed her hand on the brass handle. It was engraved with an image of a raven perched on a stack of books. The metal was ice-cold and reluctant to turn, like it resisted her intrusion, but she forced it, pushed the door, and slid into the library with a minimal creak. At once, the smell of old parchment and dust overtook her senses. A wave of oppressive hush enveloped her, so intense she almost gasped. Columns of shelving stretched into a dizzying gloom, some of them leaning precariously, others still tall and proud. Candles flickered in sconces on the walls, but there was no sign of who had lit them. She felt the presence behind the shelves, a crawling awareness that something observed her every move. Rowena kept her voice locked inside her throat. She remembered the warnings, knew from the local whispers that the caretaker, once rumored to have been the librarian in a time long past, was now a creature that demanded absolute silence. One slip could end in horrifying consequences. She moved past rows of leather-bound tomes, their spines cracked with age. Now and then, her eyes flickered to titles etched in languages older than any she recognized, some with faded gold filigree, others with pale runes that seemed alive in the dim candlelight. An airy dryness coated her mouth. Even her breathing felt stifled. A library should have felt inviting and comforting, but not this one. The hush was so profound it felt more like a presence, like a living entity that thrived on devouring noise, and perhaps life itself. Rowena trod with great care, stepping only on the darkest sections of the floor to avoid squeaking boards. Occasionally she considered lighting a lantern to see better, but she feared any spark might draw attention. The feeble candlelight along the perimeter would have to suffice. At least the library had a logic to its arrangement, from left to right in what seemed an endless grid of shelves. She guessed the restricted texts, or any tome protecting the knowledge she sought, might lie deeper in. The caretaker, that horrific presence, was also likely to linger in those depths. She thought she heard the faint brush of something heavy moving across the floorboards. She froze, crouching behind a tall shelf that stank of mold. A single candle burned on a sconce overhead, giving just enough flicker to reveal motes of dust swirling in the air, but no monstrous figure was visible. Perhaps her mind was playing tricks, projecting images from all the tales she had devoured. But then, a rasping breath echoed through the aisles, a note of something bestial, heavy with mucus. The hair on Rowena's arms prickled. She dared not move. The breath came again, scratching the silence. Slow, deliberate steps followed, accompanied by a near imperceptible dragging sound that suggested a weight being pulled along as it prowled. Panic threatened to mount within her, but she forced her body to remain motionless. At length, the steps receded, and she heard a distant scuff, as if something lumbered down a far corridor. She exhaled noiselessly. Curiosity mingled with dread. If the monstrous keeper was in the south wing, she might have the opportunity to explore the north side, which branched to the older vault. The rumored volumes of dangerously potent knowledge were likely kept there. Rowena tightened her cloak around her shoulders. Gently, she emerged from her hiding place and glided across the floor, weaving between shelves. Her muscles felt taut, like a bowstring on the verge of snapping. Every time a board threatened to squeak, she halted, letting her breath become shallow. Minutes seemed to stretch into hours. She rested her hand on the edge of a battered oak desk, half rotted by time, and brushed off a layer of dust. There, hidden partially under a pile of crumbled parchment, lay a single page of handwritten notes. They have come for the knowledge, but I cannot let them carelessly rouse the tempest. She devours the living, an offering to the hush. They cannot break the quiet, or it hears them. The precarious scrawl ended abruptly. A brownish smear looking suspiciously like old blood stained the paper's edges. Rowena shivered. The caretaker might have once been a librarian who took her duty seriously, but over some unknown span of time, she had turned into something else, something that consumed both books and bodies to maintain everlasting gloom. Another scraping sound snapped Rowena from her thoughts. It was closer this time, arising from the aisle just beyond the desk. She dragged her eyes to the edge. Peering around the corner, a woman's figure glided across the opening, though that was too simple a word to describe her. Her frame was tall, almost gaunt. Wisps of brittle hair clung to her skull in a ragged halo. Her limbs seemed elongated, giving her an unnatural silhouette. And her face, only partially visible under the flickering torchlight, revealed an impossibly wide mouth with lips cracked from disuse. Rowena surrendered a silent gasp. She pressed herself against the desk, her heart thunderous in her chest. This had to be the caretaker, the monstrous keeper of the library. As if sensing her presence, the caretaker paused in her stride. She stood stock still, head cocked, as though listening. Rowena felt the caretaker's blind search for any sound, for the location and violation of silence. The caretaker took a few tentative steps, dragging one foot behind her as though it were weighed down by shackles. A scrape. Rowena could see long nails, claws, really scraping the floor. A single hiss escaped the caretaker's throat, followed by a deep sniff of the stale air. Then, as if unfurling from the shadows themselves, the caretaker let her bony arms sway forward. She moved on, her slow footsteps echoing in the corridor until they faded to nothing. Rowena counted to 100 before letting herself breathe a trace more freely. She was certain that, had she made a single sound, she would already be caught. Working up every ounce of nerve she possessed, Rowena proceeded on her quest. She knew the caretaker would continue roaming, searching for intruders. Rowena had to find the old vault quickly. Time was not on her side, and she refused to entertain the possibility of turning back empty-handed. She located a worn sign, half buried behind a collapsed shelf, that read, "Archive Hall, Access Restricted." It pointed to a spiral staircase at the library's eastern wing. The steps were carved from black stone, each dusty with centuries of disuse. Rowena carefully stepped upward, wincing at every hint of friction between her boots and the rock. She ascended in pitch darkness, her fingertips brushing the cold stone wall to maintain her balance. Soon she reached a landing. A heavy wooden door barred the entrance to the next level, reinforced by corroded iron bands. Its handle was rusted but surprisingly pliable when she turned it. Rowena slipped through into a corridor with no glow from any candle or torch. Absolute blackness loomed. She dug into her cloak's pocket and found a small tinderbox and a stub of a candle. Shielding it as best as she could, she sparked the flint. The flame sputtered, then cast a tiny glow against the damp walls. The swirling shadows it created seemed almost alive with scuttling shapes, but she forced herself to continue. A row of locked doors lined the hallway. Each displayed a tarnished nameplate or reference marker. She ventured forward until she reached the final door on the left. Its nameplate read, "Arcana Prohibited." Her heart thumped. This must be it. With a shaky hand, she tested the door's iron handle. It turned easily, and the door groaned inward. As the timid candlelight spilled into the vault beyond, she saw row upon row of old cabinets, shelves holding high-bound volumes, and tables stacked high with dusty manuscript. The announcement of her presence felt too loud, that single groan of the hinge echoing in her skull. She swallowed the lump in her throat and urged herself to keep calm. If the monstrous keeper was alerted, Rowena had no certainty she could hide for long. She entered the vault, pushing the door almost shut behind her. Her candle floated about, illuminating driftwood gray spines, their titles invisible under layers of filth. Everything exuded an aura of foreboding, as if each piece of parchment was cursed with lethal secrets. She scanned the shelves, searching for a distinct marker or label that might lead her to the legendary folio. Time stretched on in a tense hush. She skimmed through a handful of volumes, but found nothing resembling the text she sought. Finally, she approached a locked cabinet in the far corner. It was carved from dark walnut, with swirling designs that resembled twisted vines clawing upward. The lock was an old, intricate contraption. Rowena had studied basic lockpicking for just such an occasion, and she fished out her small kit. Holding her breath, mindful of every tiny click, she worked the picks in the lock. It was fussy, centuries old, and seemed reluctant to yield. Her fear spiked whenever the picks scraped too harshly. A single clang could signal her death. With a muted flick of metal, the lock gave way. Gently, Rowena slid open the cabinet's door. Inside lay a single volume, bound in black leather so worn that it looked as though it might crumble at the slightest touch. Stylized silver lettering glimmered across the cover in a strange pattern. Plucking up her courage, she lifted the book and gingerly opened the front page. She recognized a few archaic glyphs from her years of scholarly study. The text was a puzzle of old tongues, each line seemingly layered with hidden meaning, yet across the parchment, in one corner, she found a faint inscription that confirmed her suspicion. This was indeed the dreaded folio rumored to hold knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, knowledge that might, for one who paid its terrible price, grant power over the threads that wove destiny. She had found her prize. Her heart pounded in excitement but also dread, because with it came the danger of never leaving this place alive. Suddenly, a distant roar, muffled by stone walls, erupted from downstairs. Rowena jumped, nearly dropping the book. The monstrous caretaker must have discovered traces of her presence and let out a silent, domain's version of an enraged cry. She could feel the vibrations even through the vault's floor. Clearly, the caretaker realized there was an intruder defiling her sanctuary of silence. Rowena had no time to lose. She tucked the book under her arm. Dousing the candle carefully so as not to leave a trail of light, she scanned for another exit, anything to avoid retracing her path. A single small window near the ceiling offered a glimpse of swirling snow outside. It was impossibly narrow, an ancient slit designed for ventilation. She doubted she could fit through it. On the opposite side of the vault stood a door that looked older and more decayed than the one she'd entered. Without hesitation, she crept to it, praying it might lead to a different stairwell or corridor, but the doorknob refused to turn. She searched the area for a key, rummaging in the darkness, patting shelves, drawers, anywhere that might hide it, all while straining to hear noises from below. The caretaker's footsteps were louder now, accompanied by that unearthly, rasping breath. The caretaker was ascending the main stair. At last, Rowena's hand touched something metallic on a low shelf, a small ring of keys. She tried each one in the lock, mindful of the rattle they made, until, at last, one turned. She pushed the door open with trembling caution. A cramped passage greeted her. A tattered tapestry clung to the wall, threads half ripped. She recognized the weaving of a winged creature perched above a cluster of silent watchers. Despite her fear, she realized it likely depicted the caretaker's predecessor, or some ancient sentinel of knowledge. The image's warped eyes seemed to follow her as she slipped through. She found herself at the top of another narrow stairwell. Its steps spiraled downward into pitch-black gloom. No candlelight flickered here, no hint of day. But the caretaker's labored breath was pounding closer from the corridor she had just left. Rowena had to move. Steeling herself, she descended, sliding her foot along each step so as not to miscalculate her footing or make undue noise. The deeper she went, the more the air reeked of dampness and rot. She placed her free hand along the clammy wall to guide her. Then she heard a sudden, echoing shriek from behind, near the vault. The caretaker had reached the open door. A furious, guttural moan followed, and Rowena's skin prickled. That abomination was bound to this place, never letting an intruder escape once discovered. Her mind spun with thoughts of how many victims had wandered in just like her, searching for knowledge and finding only a horrific end. She made no more than a dozen steps down the spiral passage before she froze, hearing a scrape like claws on stone. It sounded from below, as if another presence was waiting there. Heart hammering, she realized the caretaker might not be the only guardian. The library might contain more than one abomination to devour the unsuspecting. Crushed between two horrors, she had little choice but to keep going. She moved deeper, forcing her eyes to adjust, arms trembling with each breath. At the passage's bottom, the darkness parted to reveal a tiny chamber housing an ancient broken table and heaps of shredded books, scattered like silent screams. The smell of old blood hung in the stale air. Shadows flickered. Light from somewhere beyond the next corridor? Or perhaps the caretaker's approach from above? Rowena risked stepping into the chamber. Here the floor was slick, as though layered in a residue of spilt liquids never cleaned. She stifled the urge to retch. She heard a slithering sound behind her. She spun to see the caretaker's pale face leaning over the stairs. Eyes rolled back, mouth parted in an expression of The caretaker had found her, sniffed her out like a predator. Rowena's breath nearly ruptured. One misstep could cause her to cry out, and the caretaker would lunge. Rowena had no illusions. If the caretaker so much as touched her, she would vanish into that horrifying maw. Desperately, Rowena clutched the black folio. She had read hints that the knowledge in these pages might give her a chance to turn the tides, but how to wield it now, in near darkness, with a monstrous figure closing in? The caretaker's gnarled arms enfolded, nails scraping the walls with a low hiss that made Rowena's blood chill. Rowena considered her options. If she somehow distracted this being, or at least slowed it, she could perhaps reach another exit. She forced herself to open the folio, her fingers shaking violently. In the candlelit gloom that reached faintly down the stair, she could make out the first lines of a rite. It spoke of commanding silence, of forging a barrier between the living and the hush. She had studied enough to hazard a guess. By reciting the lines, she might momentarily bind the caretaker to her oath of silence, but in a more literal sense, caging the monstrous presence in its own realm. But the caretaker was mere feet away, stalking forward, face twisted with delight at cornering its prey. Rowena's lips parted. She had to speak, yet uttering words in this domain was exactly what the caretaker seemed to crave, to provoke. She remembered the warning. Any sound would bring the caretaker's fury. Nonetheless, threatened with no other escape, she whispered the incantation. Her voice was nearly inaudible, but it tasted like thunder in the hush. The caretaker shrieked, a ragged, eerily silent motion contorting its face. The creature lunged, and in that same moment, Rowena forced out the final syllables. A wave of intangible force rippled through the air. For a heartbeat, the caretaker froze, grappling with an invisible chain reeling her back. The hush thickened around them, oppressive as grave earth. Rowena felt her lungs constrict. She finished her incantation, and for an instant, time seemed to pause. Then, with a monstrous roar that somehow remained half swallowed by the gloom, the caretaker buckled. Her arms flailed, her elongated fingers trying to clutch at Rowena, but she stumbled against the wall, pinned by the binding. Rowena seized her chance. She darted across the chamber, skirting the caretaker's swiping claws, ignoring the hot gush of fear in her veins. The caretaker's eyes blazed. Her mouth opened wide, letting out a voiceless wail. The hush was not total now, but warped, trembling under the pressure of Rowena's words. She found a corridor behind a splintered door in the back of the chamber. Racing through it, the folio clutched to her chest, Rowena prayed it led outside, or at least closer to an exit. The corridor was short, leading to a twisted set of steps that curved upward. She clambered up, each footstep faintly clacking on the stone despite her best efforts. The caretaker's savage keening echoed behind her. Halfway up she heard the caretaker's pursuit, no longer fully restrained by the incantation, only slowed by it. Rowena emerged into a small anteroom. A battered wooden door faced her, partially rotted. Light seeped in through the cracks, suggesting an exit into the cold mountain air. She shoved it open, the wood splintering in protest. She found herself in a walled courtyard behind the library. The slope of the mountain was not far, the path hidden by swirling fog. Freedom was within reach, but a rasping wheeze behind her told her the caretaker was close. The monstrous figure lurched into the faint daylight, snarling at the sudden brightness. Rowena turned, just in time to see the caretaker fling herself forward, those long arms outstretched. With a muted shriek of her own, Rowena ducked aside, feeling those nails skim her shoulder. Pain swelled where they raked across her cloak, but she kept her balance, staggering toward the courtyard's crumbling gate. The caretaker's face twisted in agony at the meager sunlight. Perhaps, long isolated in the gloom, the creature had never fully braved the mountain's daylight in centuries. In one last desperate sprint, Rowena flung her body forward, darting through the broken gate. She heard the caretaker's infuriated howl behind her, the sound rattling the dead pines. But she did not stop running. Cold wind whipped at her face. Her breath seared her lungs. She kept going down the rocky slope, half blind with terror, the black folio clutched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She risked one backward glance and saw the caretaker stooped in the half-shadow of the gate, screeching silently. As if torn between leaving the library and preserving her wretched domain, tears stung Rowena's eyes as she finally reached the trail leading down the mountain. She kept her silence, fear strangling any cry of triumph. She had, by some miracle, found and escaped with the forbidden text. The caretaker's enraged shrieks chased her, echoing through the peaks as she vanished down the rugged path. Lost in the swirl of wind and snow, the library's hold on her began to loosen, though she suspected nightmares of that monstrous presence would never truly fade. When at last she returned to the village, the locals stared wide-eyed. No one dared ask her what had happened, but they knew. She limped to the local inn, wordless, still too shaken by the memory of hollow eyes and gnashing teeth. That evening, she locked herself in her room and dared to flick through the folio's pages by candlelight. The knowledge was there, dark and potent. She felt its weight pressing down like a prophecy, but with it came the memory of a dreadful hush and the monstrous keeper that roamed the library's aisles, devouring those who broke its sacred silence. From that day on, Rowena lived with one consolation. She had not merely heard the stories, she had seen the caretaker. In all her horror, she had forced the silent domain itself to bend, however briefly, and had emerged with the relic that had beckoned countless others to their doom. Yet she never truly left the hush behind. In the nights that followed, she would wake gasping for air, convinced that the caretaker was outside her door, bony fingers scraping for purchase, ready to drag her back to an eternity of wordless dread. And in time, as she studied the folio's spells and incantations, she sometimes wondered if she hadn't carried a piece of the library's darkness with her, for whenever she turned a page, she felt that hush descend around her, reminding her that certain knowledge demands silence, even if that silence is enforced by a terrible and eternal hunger.